A 3-year-old pointed at a painting and asked, "Is that little girl me?" The man standing behind her went pale, and the floor seemed to tilt under his feet. He wasn't looking at a picture. He was looking at a ghost he'd buried 30 years ago. By the end of what you're about to hear, you'll understand exactly why that single sentence, spoken by a toddler who didn't know any better, cracked open a secret an entire family had spent 3 decades trying to keep sealed. Stay with me because the last twist isn't the one you're expecting. My name doesn't matter for this one. What matters is the house. Ravenswood sat on 11 acres above the Newport coastline, the kind of property that shows up in architecture magazines with captions like "Old Money Reimagined." It didn't feel like a home. It felt like a museum that happened to have a bed in it somewhere. Nathaniel Calloway, Nate, to the maybe 4 people alive who were allowed to call him that, stood at the window of his study on a gray Tuesday morning, watching fog roll off the lawn like it was trying to erase the whole estate. He was 36. He ran Calloway Dynamics, a shipping and clean energy company his father had started with 2 trucks, and Nate had turned into something that showed up on the fortune list every spring. Business magazines called him a visionary. His own staff called him fair but cold. The tabloids had a nastier name for him, the Newport Iceberg, and he'd never once bothered correcting them. He hadn't really smiled since the accident that took both his parents 6 years back. There was a hollow spot in his chest that had been there since he was a boy. When he'd gotten so good at ignoring, he mostly forgot it was there. Somewhere in this house was a story nobody talked about, hidden in the portraits lining the east corridor, locked behind a nursery door nobody had opened in almost 30 years. Nate had learned a long time ago that some doors are easier left shut. 2 floors down, in the kitchen wing, Marisol Duarte was tying her apron with hands that moved faster than her brain could keep up with, already running late. Mari was 31, a single mom who'd been the live-in housekeeper at Ravenswood for about 4 months, ever since the staffing agency placed her there after her last job folded overnight. It wasn't the life she'd pictured for herself. She'd wanted to teach elementary school once, back before Bill stopped caring what she wanted. Her daughter's future outweighed her own disappointment. Every single time, no contest. Her daughter was the complication nobody at the agency knew about, one the estate manager, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Diane Whitcomb, had only agreed to because Mari genuinely had nowhere else to turn. Her sitter had moved out of state the week before with almost no warning, so Mari had no option but to bring 3-year-old Daisy to work and tuck her into the little playroom off the laundry area. Stay out of sight, stay out of the way. Daisy Duarte was small for her age, a halo of dark curls, enormous brown eyes that seemed to catalog everything they landed on. She was, by nature, a wanderer and wanderers. As anybody who's raised a toddler can tell you, do not stay where you leave them. "Baby, stay right here for me, okay?" Mari knelt in the laundry room, tugging Daisy's cardigan straight. "Mommy has to go clean upstairs. Color your pictures and I'll come check on you soon, promise." Daisy nodded like she was signing a contract, gripping her crayon box like it held state secrets. "Okay, Mommy." Mari kissed the top of her head and hurried off, already sorting through the day's endless task list. She didn't notice Daisy's eyes drift toward the open door, toward the long hallway beyond it, toward soft golden light spilling in from windows in a part of the house she'd never been allowed to see. 3 minutes, that's all it took. Daisy set her crayon down, tiptoed to the door, and peeked around it. The hallway on the other side was wide and hushed, lined with tall doors and gilt-framed paintings stretching toward a ceiling taller than any she'd ever seen. It looked like something out of a storybook, and curious little girls cannot resist storybooks. She wandered out, sneakers silent on the marble, fingers trailing the wall as she passed one painting after another. Stiff-faced men in dark suits, women in old-fashioned dresses. A golden retriever posing beside a fountain. She was so busy looking up she nearly walked into a side table, and that's when she saw it. At the far end of the corridor, in a section of the house nobody had dusted on purpose in years, hung a portrait that didn't match the others. It wasn't stiff or formal. It showed a little girl, maybe 2 or 3, in a soft white dress, seated on a garden bench with sunlight caught in her dark curls and a small, shy, almost smile. Daisy stopped walking, tilted her head the exact way kids do when something doesn't add up yet, and slowly raised one small finger to point at it. 2 floors above, Nate had just stepped out of a call with his board, tie loosened, patience thin. He was halfway down the grand staircase when he heard it, a small, unfamiliar voice, drifting from the one hallway in the entire house he never let anyone linger in. He rounded the corner just as Mari came sprinting from the other direction, breathless, panic all over her face. "Daisy, oh my God, I am so sorry," but Nate wasn't looking at Mari. He was looking at the little girl standing in front of his sister's portrait, finger pressed to the frame, head tilted up in total innocence. And in that frozen half-second, Nate felt something crack open in his chest that had been sealed shut for 29 years. Nobody moved for a full minute. Mari's hand shot toward her daughter, certain she was about to lose the most stable job she'd had in over a year. Housekeepers did not let their kids wander into a billionaire's private wing, let alone touch priceless family portraits. "Mr. Calloway, I am so sorry," she scooped Daisy onto her hip. "She got away from me for 1 second, I promise." "Wait." His voice came out quiet, not sharp. That confused Mari more than shouting would have. Nate stepped closer, eyes locked on the small painting his mother had commissioned when he was 5, a portrait of his baby sister, Josephine, in the rose garden behind the old West Wing. He hadn't looked directly at it in years. Looking too long always felt like pressing on a wound that never fully closed. "Is that little girl me?" Daisy asked, still pointing, oblivious to the storm her question had just detonated. Mari opened her mouth to correct her daughter. "No, sweetheart, that's just a painting." But the words caught the moment she actually looked at the portrait herself. The resemblance stopped her cold. The same tumble of dark curls, the same wide brown eyes, even a small dimple on the left cheek, right where the girl in the painting almost but not quite smiled. Nate crouched down slowly, bringing himself to Daisy's eye level, something he hadn't done for a child in longer than he could remember. "No," he said finally, rougher than he meant it. "That was my sister when she was about your age." "Where is she now?" Daisy asked, fearless. "I don't know," Nate said quietly. And for the first time since she'd started working there, Mari saw something flicker behind the billionaire's carefully composed face that looked a lot like grief. Not stress, not annoyance. Old, unhealed grief. "Mr. Calloway, I really am sorry," Mari said again, softer. "I'll make sure she doesn't come this way again." Nate straightened, some of that composure sliding back over his face. "It's fine." No harm done. He glanced once more at Daisy, already tugging a loose thread on her mother's sleeve. "What's her name?" "Daisy." "Daisy Duarte." Nate nodded slowly, filing that name away somewhere he didn't fully understand yet. "Keep the laundry room door shut if you can," he said, and there wasn't any of the coldness in it the words might have carried from anyone else. "This hallway isn't really for guests." He walked off without another word. But Mari noticed he looked back once, right before the corner, not at her, at the portrait, then at Daisy, like he was trying to talk himself out of a resemblance he couldn't unsee. That night after Daisy was asleep in the small cottage behind the main house, Mari sat with a mug of tea going cold, unable to shake the strange, heavy feeling that had settled over her. She thought about her own mother, Rosa, who'd passed 3 years earlier after a long illness. Rosa had always been vague about her own childhood, vague in a way little Mari had never questioned, but that had needled at her more the older she got. Rosa had grown up bouncing through foster care in Rhode Island, adopted around age 4 by a kind, working-class family in Providence. She almost never talked about the years before that. When teenage Mari had pushed, her mother's eyes would go somewhere far off and she'd just say, "Some things are better left where they are, Mija," sitting alone in the dark now. Mari found herself wishing badly that she'd pushed harder. Here's where things start moving fast, so stay with me. Over the following days, something shifted at Ravenswood, subtle but undeniable. Nate found himself walking past the east corridor more than his route required, slowing near the portrait he'd avoided for years. More than once he caught himself watching Daisy through the kitchen window while she played in the garden, her laugh doing something to his chest he couldn't name. He told himself it meant nothing. Kids look like other kids all the time. But late one night, unable to sleep, Nate found himself standing in front of his late mother's writing desk, staring at a locked drawer he hadn't touched since her funeral. His hand hovered over the small brass key he'd carried around for 6 years without ever using it. For the first time, he turned it in the lock. Some doors, once opened, don't close again. The drawer stuck from years of disuse, and when he wrenched it free, dust lifted into the lamplight like smoke. Inside, old letters tied off with faded ribbon, a handful of curling photographs, and a leather-bound journal stamped CC in gold. Constance Calloway. His grandmother, not his mother, the drawer had been hers. Its contents never sorted through after she died. He sat down heavy and opened to the first page, eyes adjusting to her elegant, slanted handwriting. Early entries were mundane: dinner parties, charity galas, complaints about the gardener. But further in, the tone shifted, shorter, shakier. And then, on a page dated nearly 30 years back, 4 words that stopped Nate's blood cold: "I did something unforgivable." His hands trembled as he kept reading. The entry was fragmented, soaked in guilt, written by a woman wrestling with a decision she couldn't undo. She wrote about protecting the family name, about the scandal it would have caused, about arranging in the dead of night. Without her own son's knowledge, for a 2-year-old girl to be placed with a family who'd never be able to trace her back to them. Nate's stomach dropped through the floor. He'd grown up being told his baby sister, Josephine, had died of a sudden illness at age 2. A tragedy so painful his parents rarely spoke of it, and when they did, their eyes filled with a grief so heavy young Nate learned fast never to ask follow-up questions. He'd spent his whole life believing he'd lost a sister to sickness, cruel, but at least honest. The journal told him something else entirely. There's no gentle way to write this, even to myself. Josephine is not gone. She's alive. I could not let the truth about her father destroy this family's name, so I arranged, through people I trusted, to have her placed for adoption far from here. My son believes she died. It's a lie I'll carry to my grave, because the alternative would have ruined everything we built. Nate had to read that passage 3 times before it fully landed. His grandmother, elegant, composed, unshakable Constance Calloway, had orchestrated his sister's disappearance. Not death, disappearance. A lie constructed to protect a secret so shameful she'd let her own son believe his daughter died in his arms rather than risk it surfacing. What could possibly have been worth that? He kept flipping and found a folded sheet tucked near the back, an adoption placement record, faded but legible, listing a defunct Providence agency, and a date lining up almost exactly with the journal's timeline. The child's name had been changed for the placement, but a shaky handwritten note in the margin, added years later by the look of it, read, "She'd be a grown woman by now. I wonder if she has children of her own. I wonder if I'll ever have the nerve to find out before I'm gone." Nate sat back, heart hammering. He thought of Rosa Duarte, the woman Mari had mentioned once in passing, her mother, who'd grown up bounced through foster and adoptive care in Providence, roughly the right distance. Roughly the right era. He thought about the way Mari's expression had guarded itself whenever her mother's childhood came up. He thought about a 3-year-old girl with dark curls and a familiar dimple standing in his hallway, pointing at a portrait of a girl who'd vanished from every official record nearly 30 years ago. Is that little girl me? The question that had seemed so innocent now felt like it had arrived from somewhere impossible to ignore. Nate didn't sleep that night. He sat at his grandmother's desk until sunrise, mind spinning through possibilities he wasn't ready to say out loud, not even to himself. Because if he was right, if the timeline held, if the resemblance wasn't just coincidence, if his grandmother's guilt-soaked confession was true, then the housekeeper's daughter, the little girl living in the cottage behind his own estate, wasn't a stranger at all. She might be family, his family, the only blood relative he had left on this planet, hiding in plain sight in his own laundry room. And he had absolutely no idea how to tell her mother without blowing both their lives apart. Truth, once suspected, has a bad habit of refusing to stay quiet. For 3 days, Nate said nothing. He told himself he needed certainty before he turned Mari Duarte's whole world upside down over a possibility this enormous. So he called the one person he trusted with something this sensitive, Gerald Voss, the Calloway family's longtime attorney, a man who'd handled his parents' estate and before that quietly cleaned up more than a few family messes without ever asking uncomfortable questions. They met at a quiet corner table in a restaurant downtown, far from anyone at Ravenswood who might overhear. I need you to look into an old adoption record, Nate said, sliding the folded placement document across the table. Providence Agency, roughly 29 years back. And everything you can find on a woman named Rosa Duarte, deceased about 3 years now, who was adopted around that time. Voss's expression barely shifted. But something in his posture straightened. Just find out, please. It took 4 days. Days during which Nate found himself spending far more time near the kitchen wing than his schedule had any business allowing. Telling himself it was proximity while deep down knowing he was watching Daisy, the shape of her laugh, the way she scrunched her nose when she concentrated. The exact same nose, he realized with a jolt one afternoon, that showed up in nearly every childhood photo of his own father. Mari noticed the shift in him too, though she couldn't name it. Mr. Calloway had started greeting her in the mornings, asking how Daisy was settling in. It unsettled her more than his old coldness ever had. On the 4th evening, Voss returned with a thin manila folder and a grave expression that told Nate everything before he said a word. The Providence Agency closed decades ago, Voss said, laying documents across the desk. But state records survived the transition. A female child, roughly 2 years old, placed for adoption 29 years back this past spring. No birth parent names listed. The record was sealed and arranged privately, through a third party instead of the standard agency channel. That's the kind of arrangement someone makes when they've got money and want a paper trail that goes cold fast. Nate's jaw tightened. And Rosa Duarte, adopted by the Fuentes family of Providence at age 3.5. After a year and a half bouncing through foster placements, consistent with a private arrangement that fell through once before a permanent family took her in. She was raised as Rosa Fuentes until she married a man named Duarte and kept the surname professionally. Voss paused. I ran the sealed file's cross-reference number against the state birth archive. It's not conclusive without a DNA test, but the original birth certificate, before it was sealed and reissued under the adoptive family's name. He slid the final document across. Nate stared down at it, breath-catching. The name on the original sealed birth certificate read, Josephine Rose Calloway, his sister, not dead. Given away in secret by their own grandmother, raised under a different name in a town less than 40 miles from the house where Nate had grown up believing he was the last of his family. Which meant Rosa Duarte, Mari's mother, had been Josephine Calloway, which meant Marisol Duarte was his niece, which meant Daisy was his great-niece. Blood family. The only blood family Nate Calloway had left in the entire world, and she'd been living in a cottage behind his own house for 4 months without either of them having the faintest clue. Nate sat frozen, the document shaking slightly in his hand. Decades of grief and loneliness colliding all at once with something he hadn't let himself feel in years. Hope, terrifying and completely unfamiliar. There's something else, Voss said quietly, and Nate looked up, already bracing. Your cousin Pippa's been asking my office questions about the estate succession plan. About what happens to the Calloway holdings if you remain without a direct heir. He hesitated. I don't know how she caught wind of this so fast, but I'd move carefully. And quickly. Grief has a strange way of hiding the truth in plain sight, sometimes for decades. Nate barely slept the rest of that week. One question kept looping. Why would Constance Calloway, a woman who in his memory doted on her grandchildren and cried at his father's wedding, do something this devastating to her own family? He found the answer 2 nights later, buried deeper in the journal. It wasn't that Josephine had been unwanted. It was about who her father truly was. According to the journal, Nate's mother, young at the time and still finding her footing among Newport's old money circles, had been involved before her marriage with a man from a working-class Providence family. Josephine had been conceived before the wedding, a fact Constance had helped conceal from Nate's father for nearly 2 years through careful lies about a premature birth. When Constance discovered, through a private investigator she'd hired out of paranoid suspicion, that the timeline didn't add up, she made a decision in a moment of panic she'd regret for the rest of her life. Rather than risk exposing what she believed would destroy her son's marriage and the family's standing, she arranged for the child to quietly vanish. A staged illness, paid off doctors and staff. A lie that let her own son believe his daughter had died in his arms. The final entries were the hardest to read. Constance, sick and racked with guilt in her last years, had quietly hired someone to try to locate Josephine, only to learn she'd already passed away herself, leaving behind a daughter of her own. Constance never worked up the nerve to reach out. She died with the secret still locked in her desk, waiting nearly a decade for someone to finally open that drawer. Nate closed the journal and sat in the dark a long time, letting the full weight of it settle. A lie this enormous had shaped his entire childhood, robbed his sister of a family who never knew to search for her, and left him alone in a mansion full of portraits of people who'd hidden more than they'd ever shared. Whether Josephine had truly been his father's biological daughter no longer mattered to him. She'd been his sister in every way that counted. And her daughter and her granddaughter deserved to know the truth. The next morning, Nate found Mari in the garden, kneeling by a flower bed while Daisy helped by yanking up perfectly healthy tulips. "Mari, can we talk?" "It's important." She stood, brushing dirt off her knees, immediately worried. "Is everything okay? Can you tell me about your mother, Rosa?" "What do you actually know about where she came from?" The question caught her off guard. "Not much. She grew up in foster care, adopted by a family in Providence as a toddler. She never really talked about it." "Why?" Nate steadied himself for words he'd rehearsed a dozen times. "Because I think your mother might have been my sister." He walked her through it as gently as he could, the journal, the sealed adoption record. The birth certificate under the name Josephine Rose Calloway, the timeline matching almost perfectly with Rose's own adoption into the Fuentes family. Her expression shifted from confusion to disbelief, to something raw and overwhelmed as the pieces clicked into place. That's not possible," Mari said, though her voice wavered with uncertainty more than conviction. "My mother never said anything about being a Calloway. She would have told me." "Wouldn't she? She might not have known," Nate said quietly. "If the placement was sealed and handled privately, it's possible the adoptive family never knew where she came from either. My grandmother made sure of that. She made sure of everything." Old bitterness edged into his voice. "I only found out because I finally opened a drawer I'd been avoiding for 6 years." Mari sank onto the garden bench, hands trembling in her lap, while Daisy made a wobbly attempt to catch a butterfly nearby, blissfully unaware the adults were quietly rearranging her entire family history. "It means you're my niece," Nate said, the words strange in his own mouth but true in a way he hadn't felt sure of anything in a long time. "And Daisy's my great-niece. It means you're family." "My only family." Mari's eyes filled with tears she hadn't seen coming. She thought about her mother, gone 3 years now, who'd carried an ache Mari always sensed but never understood, the ache of dying without ever knowing she had a brother, or her own real name. "I want a DNA test," Mari said, steadying her voice. "Not because I doubt you, but if this is true, I want it certain." "Already arranged," Nate said. "Discreetly, through a private lab." They agreed to move quietly, before the tangled question of inheritance Voss had already warned him about could spiral into something ugly. But secrets in a house this closely watched don't tend to stay buried long. Here's where things take a sharper turn, so buckle in for this next part. Pippa Calloway Reed, Nate's cousin, and for 6 years, the presumptive heir to a serious chunk of the Calloway holdings, had spent that time quietly cultivating relationships with her cousin's attorneys and staff, anyone who might tip her off early to anything threatening her position. She heard through an informant that Voss had made an unusual visit to the estate, followed by a private lab technician. Pippa didn't believe in coincidences. By the following Monday, she knew almost as much as Nate did, and sat in her Manhattan apartment calculating exactly how much a sudden, inconvenient, long-lost great-niece could cost her. Danger, when it's dressed up as concern, is easy to mistake for the real thing. Pippa showed up at Ravenswood unannounced on a Thursday afternoon, dressed in the kind of understated elegance that made her look effortlessly at home in rooms that weren't technically hers. Nate found her waiting in his study, sitting comfortably in the chair across his desk like she'd been invited. "Pippa," he said flatly, "I don't recall this being on my calendar. It's a family matter, cousin, so I didn't think I needed one." Her smile was warm and practiced, entirely without warmth underneath. "I hear congratulations might be in order. A long-lost great-niece showing up right in your household staff. What are the odds?" "I'm not sure what you're referring to." "Please, Nate." "I have people too." She crossed her legs, unbothered. A young single mother conveniently placed in your household, conveniently resembling a portrait that's hung here for decades. You don't find that tidy. I'd hate to see you taken advantage of by someone clever enough to stage the perfect discovery. She didn't research anything, Nate said, voice low and controlled though anger simmered underneath. She didn't even know her mother's birth name until I told her, this isn't a con. Or that's exactly what a very good con looks like from the inside. Her tone stayed sweet. I'm trying to protect this family. Our grandmother spent her whole life protecting the Calloway name. And I'm not about to watch some housekeeper's daughter undo it because you're lonely enough to want it to be true. Nate's jaw tightened. Get out of my house, Pippa. She rose gracefully, gathering her purse like someone who'd already set something in motion. I'll be in touch with Voss about the succession paperwork, she said at the door. I do hope, for your sake, that test comes back the way you're hoping, because if it doesn't, people do talk, Nate. And housekeepers with convenient stories tend to find their reputations get complicated rather quickly. The threat landed exactly the way she intended. Nate found Mari later that evening and told her, reluctantly, about Pippa's visit. Her face went pale as she absorbed the implication that her presence in this house was about to become a target. She thinks I planned this, Mari said quietly, that I orchestrated all of it just to get to your money. She's grasping. It won't hold up against the truth. It doesn't have to hold up, Mari said, sharper than she meant to. It just has to make people doubt me long enough to hurt us. I have a daughter to think about. Just Nate, he said quietly. And I promise you, I won't let anything happen to either of you. Mari studied him a long moment, something shifting in her expression, not quite trust yet. But the start of it, a quiet companionship neither of them had expected, that Nate hadn't felt with anyone since before his parents died. The lab results come back Friday, she said finally. Let's get through that first. If you've made it this far, stick around, because what happens at that reading is the moment this whole story turns. Friday arrived heavier than any day Nate could remember since his parents' funeral. He and Mari sat together in Voss's downtown office, an envelope on the desk between them that neither had touched, like leaving it sealed could preserve every possibility a little longer. Daisy sat on the floor nearby, happily stacking a set of toy blocks Voss's assistant had scrounged up, completely unaware the next few minutes would reshape the rest of her life. Whenever you're ready, Voss said gently. Mari looked at Nate. Nate looked at Mari. Neither reached for it first. Together, Nate finally said, and they each set a hand on the envelope, opening it as one. Voss read the results aloud, his voice steady and clinical in the way lawyers train themselves to deliver even the biggest news. The probability of biological relation between Nathaniel Calloway and Marisol Duarte, consistent with a great-uncle, great-niece relationship, is confirmed at 99.7%. Josephine Rose Calloway, presumed deceased in childhood, in fact lived a full life under the name Rosa Fuentes Duarte, married, and passed away 3 years ago, survived by a daughter and granddaughter who, until a few weeks ago, had no idea the family they'd lost had never actually been lost at all. Mari burst into tears the moment the number was read out, decades of her mother's unexplained sadness suddenly making sense. Nate sat frozen a long moment, not shock exactly. Some part of him had known since that first afternoon in the hallway, but the sheer, overwhelming relief of no longer being the last Calloway standing alone in an empty house. I have a family, he said quietly, almost to himself. Daisy toddled over and tugged his sleeve. Why's Mommy crying? Nate knelt down and found himself smiling, a real smile, unguarded, unfamiliar on his own face. Happy crying. Sometimes grown-ups cry when something really good happens. Like finding out you have family you didn't know you had. He glanced at Mari, laughing and wiping her eyes. Daisy, that painting, that was your great-grandmother, Josephine. And I'm your great-uncle. Daisy considered this with the enormous seriousness only a 3-year-old can bring to news of this size. So the painting girl was me, she said finally, satisfied, like the mystery she'd raised weeks ago had properly been solved. The room dissolved into laughter and tears, and for one moment, the looming threat of Pippa and the fight sure to follow felt very far away. It didn't stay far away for long. Pippa filed a formal challenge to the DNA test within the week, questioning the lab's chain of custody, threatening to drag the family through a public inheritance dispute unless Nate agreed to a settlement generous enough to keep her quiet. Voss warned it could take months and put Mari and Daisy under a spotlight neither had asked for. Nate called a private meeting instead, not lawyers, not a courtroom, just one final conversation, cousin to cousin. "You can fight this in court," he told Pippa. "Or you can accept that I have a family now. Real family. Blood family. A great niece who lost her grandmother and mother before she ever got to know them. I'm prepared to fight this as long as it takes. But I'd rather not because I'm scared of you, but because I finally have something worth protecting." Pippa studied him a long moment, searching for the leverage she'd always relied on and finding it wasn't there anymore. She withdrew her challenge 3 days later. Healing rarely shows up all at once. It arrives in small, ordinary moments that quietly stack into something whole. Over the following weeks, Ravenswood began to feel less like a museum and more like a home. Mari and Daisy moved out of the small staff cottage and into a suite in the main house. Not out of obligation, Nate insisted, but because family didn't live in the servants' quarters. Not in his house, not anymore. Mari kept working for a while out of habit and pride, but Nate gently talked her into stepping back, and she finally enrolled in the teaching program she'd given up years earlier. The East Corridor, once a place Nate avoided completely, became one of Daisy's favorite spots in the house. Some afternoons, she'd stand in front of Josephine's portrait chattering to the painted little girl like old friends. About her day, about the puppy Nate had finally caved and gotten her. About the tea parties, she insisted her Uncle Nate attend every Sunday with tiny plastic cups and imaginary sugar cookies. Nate, once described by a business magazine as having the emotional warmth of a spreadsheet, found himself sitting cross-legged on his study floor every Sunday afternoon, utterly helplessly in love with the family he never knew he'd been missing. He and Mari grew closer too, in the slow, unhurried way real things grow, long conversations over coffee about Rosa. About the childhood Nate had spent in this same house, aching for a sister he'd been told had died. He shared old photographs of Josephine as a toddler. Mari shared memories of her mother's quiet kindness. Her love of gardening, a hobby Mari now realized was probably an inherited echo of the rose garden Josephine once sat in for a portrait she never knew existed. One evening, months later, Nate found Mari in the garden, the same rose garden from the painting, restored now, watching Daisy chase fireflies in the fading light. "I used to think this house was just a place I inherited," he said quietly, coming to stand beside her. "I never thought of it as somewhere I'd actually want to come home to. And now I can't imagine it without the two of you in it." Something vulnerable crossed his face. Honest in a way that had taken him 36 years to learn how to show. "I don't want to just be your uncle by blood. I want to build something real with you, with both of you, if you'll let me." Mari's eyes filled with tears for what felt like the 100th time that summer, but these ones were the good kind. "I think," she said softly, "we've all had enough of secrets in this family. Let's build something honest instead." A year later, Ravenswood hosted its first family celebration in over a decade. Not a corporate gala, a birthday party, small, loud, and drowning in balloons, for a little girl turning 4. Daisy ran across the same lawn where she'd once chased butterflies, trailing a dozen kids from her new preschool, her laugh ringing off the walls of a house that finally, genuinely felt like home. Josephine's portrait still hung in the East Corridor, but the corridor itself had been transformed, repainted, relit, filled with new photographs beside the old ones. Daisy's first day of preschool. Mari's graduation from her teaching program. Diploma held high, Nate beside her beaming with a pride that had nothing to do with business. A quiet, private wedding, held in the very rose garden where Josephine had once posed for a portrait she never lived to see hanging in a home finally free of secrets. Nate often thought back to that first afternoon, Daisy's small finger pointing at a painting, cutting straight through nearly 30 years of buried grief and inherited silence. For most of his life, he'd believed family was something you were simply born into or lost, fixed, a thing that could only ever shrink, never grow. He understood now how wrong that was. Family, he'd learned, wasn't only about blood. though in his case blood had been the thread that pulled everything into the light. It was about who chose to stay. Who chose honesty over silence, love over pride, connection over the comfortable isolation of a house full of locked doors. His grandmother had spent her whole life protecting a secret she believed would destroy the family, never understanding that the secret itself was what nearly did. It took one small, fearless voice, a 3-year-old unafraid to ask the question everyone else had spent decades too frightened to speak, to finally set a family free. If there's one thing this story leaves behind, it's this. The truth doesn't always show up where you expect it. Sometimes it comes from the smallest, most unguarded voice in the room. Sometimes healing starts the moment you're brave enough to open the door you've spent years keeping shut. And sometimes the family you've been grieving as lost has been waiting for you all along, closer than you ever imagined. So tell me, what would you have done in Nate's shoes, finding a secret like that buried in a drawer? Would you have opened it at all? Let me know where you're watching from tonight. Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if this one got you, hit like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs the reminder that it's never too late for the truth to bring a family home. Thanks so much for being here. I'll see you in the next one.